creak on the stairwell, and one turns around and sees that someone has caught him in the act. Well, at that point, the phenomenology changes dramatically. One is thrown into self-consciousness. One is thrown into reflection. One is thrown into seeing oneself as the other person sees one. So just as Genet is caught rooting through the drawer, and he's labeled a thief, and his decision to accept that label is what determines his next existence. In the case where we are caught on the stairs, being essentially a voyeur, that being caught, in a way, determines who we are. Now, as always with Sarte, who we are is an ambiguous notion. It's who we are in the eyes of the person who has caught us, and what's so painful about such a circumstance is we realize that even if this was a momentary lapse in our behavior, in the mind of this person who has seen us, perhaps seen us for the first time, this is going to be our essence. This is who we really are, a pervert, a voyeur. But we are also the way we see ourselves, because we are being for itself, we have a transcendence, and we know that this one fact, especially if this is the only time we've ever done such a thing, this one fact doesn't define us at all, but rather I define myself in terms of my ideals and the kind of person I think of myself as wanting to be. I think of myself as a moral person. I think of myself as a person who respects privacy. And so this act does not define me in my own mind. And nevertheless, I am painfully aware of the fact itself, which would seem to dictate, quite apart from whether anyone else has caught me or not, that I am, at least in this instance, a voyeur. In fact, in some cases, I catch myself. In a way, this is what moral education is all about. A child, we depend on other people to catch us in the act and tell us, this is wrong, you shouldn't act this way, you don't want to be a such and such. But of course, once we've been through that, we have what Heidegger and many people through the tradition call conscience. And the nature of conscience is that in effect, we tell ourselves, we catch ourselves doing or tending to do certain kinds of actions, and we stop ourselves. So there's a sense in which being for others really is just that. There's a sense in which being for others is being pinned, being identified, being objectified in terms of the perceptions and judgments of other people. Once again, we can go back to Camus and The Stranger, and we go to the scene where the old people are sort of ushering into the room, and Rousseau has the absurd thought that they are sitting in judgment of him. And of course, that turns out to be absolutely true, as it is more explicitly true in the second part of the novel when he is actually on trial. But the thesis here is we are all always on trial. We are always in the eyes of others, even if we have internalized those eyes so that in fact it's our own self-consciousness which imposes those external judgments. Now, there is a very strong tendency in individualistic societies, particularly in this one, for people to fight off the influence of other people and to act independently and for themselves. We've seen this in these lectures, particularly in the philosophies of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. For Kierkegaard, it is of the utmost importance that one is a Christian not because other people are Christians, but one is a Christian because one has decided all by oneself that that is what one is going to do. In Nietzsche, the attack on the herd sometimes becomes downright vicious, and the idea is that one is truly oneself. One can exercise one's talents and become who one is only by exercising the influence of the absurd, or to put it in modern terminology, not caring what other people think. What Sarte is arguing here, and Sarte certainly is an individualist as much as any of these others, but Sarte is arguing that we cannot be indifferent to what other people think. That what other people think of us is as much a part of our identity as any of the other ways in which we know ourselves, thinking of ourselves in terms of the facts of the case, thinking of ourselves in terms of our own plans and expectations. What other people think of us is a clear determinant of who we are. And so the kind of tension we talked about in the lecture on bad faith now becomes not a polar tension, but a three-way tension. We talked before about facticity versus transcendence and how we're always both, but the one tends to compromise or circumscribe the other. And so we're always pulled between seeing ourselves too much in terms of our facticity, too much in terms of our choices, plans, expectations, so on. Now we have to expand that picture, because in addition to how we think about ourselves and what the facts would seem to make true of us, there is also this question about how other people see us. And so bad faith takes on a new dimension too. One way we can ban bad faith is we can accept what other people think of us as simply the truth. And we can define ourselves just in terms of who we are for others. This, of course, is what Heidegger is talking about when he talks about the Das Man self, the anonymous self, the sense in which we are not taking charge of our own existence, but simply going along with the views and roles of others. Or conversely, one can be in bad faith in exactly the opposite way. One can say, as I said a moment ago, I don't care what other people think. That's bad faith because you cannot help but take account of what other people think. Some people would say, well, this is just kind of a psychological fact. And it's a psychological fact that's more true of some people than others. Sartre would want to counter. It's not psychology, and it's not something that is peculiar to this or that individual. It is part of the very essence of being human, that we are, if you like, social creatures, not in the rather benign community sense that someone like Aristotle defended long ago, but in the rather perverse and disturbing sense that we are the objects of other people's judgments, and the way we identify ourselves is very much part of how we are judged by other people. So what we find here is that, as Camus discovered, and as Heidegger discovers in a slightly different way, that there's a sense in which we are all guilty. What are we guilty of? Well, if you think about the shame example, if you think about the very idea of being judged by others, we are guilty both of not living up to other people's expectations of us, or sometimes we do live up to their expectations, which are very low, and then we find ourselves feeling guilty for not living up to our own expectations. And that's the trap that Heidegger tries to get us out of. For Sartre, it really does take on very much the appearance of another version of the doctrine of original sin, in a purely secular way, of course. But just as we are incapable of getting out of bad faith, because we always emphasize facticity versus transcendence and so on, so too we are incapable of avoiding bad faith in the sense that we can never get straight, as we would like to, about how much we should or how much we should not take our identity of ourselves to be in the hands and eyes of other people. To summarize this view, Sartre comes up with a couple striking formulations. One, in Being in Nothingness, is that our relationship with other people is basically conflict, quite the contrary of the rather amiable sense of community that Aristotle and other philosophers have defended. What Sartre tells us is that our relationship with other people is always, in a way, trying to set aside their judgments of us, or getting them to make judgments of us which are in line with our own judgments of ourselves. And consequently, we're always sort of playing with great difficulty with other people and the extent to which we can control them and their judgments, the extent to which they can control us and our judgments of them. And this is prone to be a very conflicted situation, since while we can all think of examples in which I think well of you, you think well of me, let's go have a beer, just as often, particularly in anything in which there is the least bit of competition, there is going to be this sense of, well, I'm better than you, let me prove it. No, I'm better than you, let me prove it. And that can take all sorts of dimensions. And we've seen that operate in every theater of human experience, and we'll talk about some of them in the next two lectures. Perhaps the most striking illustration of this, and the best slogan to sum it up, is Sartre's play No Exit. The phrase is, hell is other people. And the play itself is set in hell, and it really has a kind of diabolical setting. One should add that if it weren't for Sartre's philosophy permeating it, it could well be a piece of kitsch and not a very interesting play at all. But because it's a rather intriguing mix of, on the one hand, theatrical setting, and on the other, philosophical profundity. No Exit, I think, is often received as one of philosophy's most profound contributions to the theater. Anyway,